these stories of food systems, for example, they cannot and will not and should not be the same or be able to be replicated all over the world. A food system in the US is completely different than a food system in Norway. I can get really angry about all these things that are like, oh, we need to design this thing so it works and there's like the perfect thing, and then we're just going to scale it up. And that's not what nature does. Nature doesn't design things to scale them out. They continuously evolve and push and pull to find a way to thrive in exactly the context that they're in.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abby, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Edona Arnesen as we take a communication perspective on relationality and regenerative food systems. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Edona Arnesen. Edona is highly passionate about food, farming, food systems, relationships, and regeneration in unison, and how we can co-create better communities and systems for the common health of everything on Earth, the human and the non-human, and nature, whom she says we're all a tiny connected part of. Edona finds systems thinking and systemic design fantastically interesting, in her own words, as both philosophies and practices to act through. This is important context because where Edona and I first connected was at the Relating Systems Thinking and Design conference this last year, hosted by the Systemic Design Association. So it's important for you to know that that's a huge lens that Edona and I will both be using in this conversation. I'm really excited to share this because in my mind, it acts as sort of a follow-up to an earlier conversation I had with Aubrey Drysdale about regeneration. And that conversation, which you'll hear me say this today, and you might remember, was the first time I was introduced to the possibility of moving beyond sustainability to regeneration as a goal for ourselves, for our communities, and our environment. So all of this is making me realize that some of the language within CMM that I don't know that I specifically name or explicitly name most of the time is this language of communication as generative, as having creative energy, as constitutive. I think the way I talk about communication mirrors and reflects that, but I don't use that language of communication being generative all the time. But my attention's really being drawn back to that because of these conversations I'm having now. And the language is just really aligning for me and causing me to reflect on ways of being generative and regenerative in our communication and storytelling. So that's what I'm thinking about going into this conversation. I offer that for you to be thinking about as well. And with all of that in mind, let's begin the conversation with Edona. Hi, Edona. Welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told.
Thank you. Thank you, Abby.
I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. And I want to start our time with the question, how are we arriving? I want us both to answer. And for me, this is about context. What are we bringing with us? Who are we bringing with us into this moment? So, Edona, how are you arriving?
At the moment, I'm actually looking out at a very, very snowy landscape here in the southern part of Norway. So I'm arriving a bit with the feeling that there's still a lot left of winter, which can also be a bit comforting because it's the time of rest and reflection, which is also sort of the time that I'm in my own life right now. And also with a little bit of nervousness, but mostly joy to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. Well, I'll mirror that nervousness and joy combination because you would think after so many episodes, so many recordings, so many conversations that the nerves wouldn't ever creep in for me, but I think they do, especially as I am getting back into the rhythm of recording podcasts this year. I took a little time off to prepare for this season, and now it's like getting back into it. And there's a part of me that I just want so badly what it really is I really want to create something beautiful. But there's a part of that can dip into, well, I really want to make sure I do it right. I want to ask the perfect questions and I want to have the best conversation possible. So I think some pressure creeps in when I let those ideas take over. So how I'm arriving is kind of trying to acknowledge that piece of me that's showing up today, and then kind of, pat it on the head and say, thanks, but no thanks, and push it aside and say what one priority really is to be present in this conversation, is to learn from each other, and create something beautiful still. But that beautiful is not defined by rightness or perfection or any of that. It's about the quality of our communication and what we create here today. So thank you for indulging me in that. And I'm glad to know where you're coming from and what you're coming with. So Edona, can you please introduce yourself to us, keeping in mind the kind of topic of conversation that we know we want to explore today? What should we know about you?
Yeah, this is a good question. I do really enjoy the focus on context, because for me, we can talk more about this later, but context is everything. And me, I'm a very curious person who thinks a lot and reflects a lot, and I'm always finding new areas to dive into and add to my sort of library of interest and knowledge and skills that further inform my worldview and my understanding of this life, this place, or whatever place I'm at. And I think a lot of this started when I did my master's degree in agroecology at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And I had come from a very, very sort of strict traditional teaching and learning style, doing a bachelor's in civil engineering.
Oh, yeah.
Which I enjoyed it. I was really good at maths and everything, and I could really love doing a lot of math. But it was I often draw the analogy of being a horse with shutters on the sides. So you're staring at this presentation that your teacher is doing, and this is the focus. While when I joined the agroecology masters with a super diverse international group of people, it was like 360-degree view after being in the dark for a while. Yeah, that really opened my mind to the beauty of diversity and to reflecting a lot. We had a lot of discussions and reflection sessions as part of the teaching and part of the learning. So that has definitely shaped me a lot. And that's about 8 years ago. So other than that little awakening, I've spent a lot of my time in the hospitality industry around food, sort of starting in the restaurant industry, doing dishes as a summer job. And then I've been moving in all parts, doing a lot of service, being with a lot of people and guests, and working in kitchens, bakeries, cooking, working with wine, just getting immersed in the whole food part. And also the agroecology course brought me into the farm part. So we did a lot of farm visits and on-farm work, which is what I've gotten more and more interested in the past years. So I do recognize myself as a systems thinker, perhaps not yet as a systemic designer, but a little bit. But this is a new field of interest that I'm really enjoying. So yeah. That's me. I'm a very curious, active person who love to meet new people and to hear new things that might make me think differently.
That's a great place to start. And I love that you are calling out this context of the systemic thinking, that's how we first crossed paths at a systemic thinking and design conference. And I have that lens on and was already thinking about how you describe the difference between these two fields of study and the kind of maybe systems that those were, and how the way that those systems were designed shaped your experience of them in terms of having those blinders on or having a wider perspective. For people who don't know, can you describe, and I'll not to act like I'm one of those people, but I don't have a full understanding of it. What is agroecology, or what's encompassed within studying that or working with that?
So it's a field very much ingrained in food systems. So of course the agro part is about agriculture and food production and food systems. And the combination of agriculture and ecology pushes it more in the direction of focusing on ecological agriculture or agriculture in nature's ways, on nature's premises. For me, it's also very, very much about the social dimension instead of just normal agriculture. Let's say that, like, let's say you're studying agriculture, that's very much more technical. It's on the biology and the chemistry part, while agroecology is more holistic, but it's also a lot about, for example, the emancipation of farmers or of communities and transparency and fairness. I think a really good example is something many people might have heard about, which is Via Campesina, which is a huge farmers movement that started in Latin America, which is very much about the rights of small holder farmers. So it's a combination of a lot of things, but it's very much about sustainable, resilient food systems in a holistic sense.
I'm curious if you could kind of lay out an example of a food system. Just, I know we're going to talk about, different ways of creating food systems, but I kind of want to start basic because what I can speak to in the United States is that I think so many people are so disconnected from understanding where their food comes from and what goes into it, all of the effects that the processes have on our world, because everything's at our fingertips. I can get almost anything at the store almost all year round, and so I don't think I probably, and a lot of people have the greatest appreciation for food systems and their complexity and their nuance. So I wonder if you could maybe break down an example of what all's encompassed when you are considering a food system.
I think most people might be more familiar with thinking in terms of value chains.
Okay.
Or like the food value chain, which is what I want to move us away from. So we think in a more systemic way, which does encompass more things. But of course, very, very simply put, it's everything from the production site, the farm, the farmers, the seeds, the crops, the animals, the produce that is produced. And of course, like the road, the travel of the food from maybe the production to sorting and packing, cleaning, these kind of things that might happen another place. Very often it does in our globalized big scale food system. Then it might be transported to another place, a warehouse, or to supermarkets, or to any kind of place where it reaches the customers. And of course, it gets sold and bought and cooked and consumed and wasted or composted and all these things. So that's sort of the food system simply put. But I do really care a lot about and work with also putting the people back into the food systems, as we are all part of the food system because we are all eaters. We all have to eat, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so incredibly interesting to work with food systems, because it's one of the few completely universal things in the world. Everyone has to eat. So everyone is partaking in a food system in some kind of way. So yeah, simply put, it's sort of the activities and things that go into producing and consuming food.
Yeah. Tell me more about the social or relational component you see there.
Well, I think for some reason in a very short time, we've become just used to thinking of ourselves as disconnected, or we don't even think of ourselves as disconnected. We just see ourselves as outside these systems. It's happening over there. Nature is acting, or biological processes are happening, something is growing, animals are living, things are being produced, and we're just looking at it from afar, not just because we're consumers and not food producers ourselves, just like humans in general. And we've forgotten that we are also just a small part of the puzzle of all the processes. And I was watching a really good and kind of funny documentary yesterday, which was all about how to use human waste what goes into the toilet as fertilizer for food production to put the poop back in the loop. Yeah, it was great.
Creative.
And yeah, but very much about this. It's a nutrient cycle. It's a natural nutrient cycle.
Yeah.
And we've broken it because we have stopped thinking of ourselves as part of this important natural cycles.
Mm-hmm.
Stepping away from that thought a little bit, we are completely dependent on relationships in order to survive, and not just between each other, but actually with all these other life forms.
Mm-hmm.
The non-human is often used as a term. I think we have a lot to gain to re-strengthen or build anew these relationships that we have to our surroundings.
Yeah, this feels like one of those moments where I'm especially excited to use a communication perspective. The kind of visual that's
Yeah,
coming
go
to
ahead.
mind is like looking at something on a table. I just want to be like, gather around everyone, like put on your communication glasses and like, let's look at this. This is really interesting and a great example of like why you should use a communication perspective, because I'm thinking about the stories that we have about ourselves and our relationships to something like food systems. I think basically for me, the practice that is so important that applies to this situation is remembering that meaning is socially constructed. That's such a central part of the CMM theory and communication perspective. And then not only that, but seeing yourself. It's us. It's, socially constructed, relationally constructed is other words that people use to kind of highlight the, way it happens between people. And so it's important first you can see yourself as a meaning maker, a storyteller. And then once you have that lens, I think it makes it easier to look at the stories you've already been given and think about the people that made the meaning around those stories, because there's so many stories within our societies and our cultures that I think we take for granted because these stories started to be told so long ago that we forget that there was like a choice involved there. And so I think that's why it's so important to bring all of our different diverse stories together, because that helps expand the imagination, first of all, I think, about what's possible, and helps us to understand and see what we know to be true as just one story out of many. There are many different cultures that relate to nature in very different ways that put, for example, like people in the United States, like our relationship to nature as being like very disconnected. I'm not a part of the ecosystem. Humans are separate from animals. Like that's one story, but there's plenty of other stories that have human beings as being much more deeply related to nature and ecosystem and a food system. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm pulling out of what you're saying already, to be like, here's the moment where you can learn something from using a communication perspective that you maybe wouldn't pay attention to if you weren't specifically looking at this conversation in terms of stories.
Yeah, and I think the stories we've been told, and it's hard sometimes to even know that there are alternative
Yes.
stories,
Yeah.
because this is just what we've been told. And if it's not an area that we are extremely curious or interested about, we might not care to find other stories, or not that we might not be wanting to listen to them if we hear an alternative story, but if we are in the same surroundings all the time, the same relationships, the same contexts, those stories might never be challenged. And for me, that's one reason it's really, really important to meet new people, and why I am very free in contacting people that I come across that I find interesting or just would like to connect with. I've also thought a lot, I guess, this past year about how I reproduce certain stories through my behavior or way of talking or way of thinking and reacting, and then slowly seeing those patterns. And especially when you feel friction with other people.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's where the magic
Yes.
really
Oh,
happens,
yeah.
if you're able to stop and just feel that friction and then maybe reflect a little bit about it. It's like, oof, that's a bit uncomfortable. Why is this uncomfortable? Usually it's because it's another story that doesn't completely align with yours, and we have
Yeah.
to do a value check, or we have to learn new things. We have to find new paths for the thoughts
Yes.
to connect in our brains.
Yeah, I love that point about dissonance. And it's reminding me that I was in a meeting yesterday, and someone who's been on the podcast before actually and is a steward at the CMM Institute, Beth Fisher Yoshida, said if she goes a day where she doesn't experience dissonance, then she knows she hasn't been curious enough, or she hasn't pushed or leaned in hard enough, you know? And I thought that was really beautiful of like, you know, so many of us try to create our lives in a way
Mm.
that limits discomfort.
Yeah. Oh, I'm happy you said that word, because I
Yeah.
think that is one of our biggest issues in changing things that we don't like.
Yeah.
Like, instead of just accepting them,
Yeah.
we have to be okay with being in the uncomfortable.
Hmm.
It's fine. I think it's really detrimental to be comfortable all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And change itself is a discomfort. So it's, you know, we
Mm.
have to get through that noise of
Mm.
or fear maybe around change to get through, well, what even is the change? What could be different here?
Mm.
And yeah, see, again, the language in CMM is we're active participants. We co-construct our social worlds. So to me, that's
Mm.
like, it's scary maybe, but also I think really empowering language when you can start to see yourself as having that role and see other people as having that role. It's all relational. It's not just, you know, individual by any means.
Yeah, and I think we I think we need to remember that everything, like you say, like our words are social constructs.
Hmm.
And also all the physical things around us are
Yeah.
constructs from before or now or whatever. We made a lot of the things in our world, so we are also able to remake them or make new
Hmm.
things or change them.
Hmm.
And I think that's I really hope everyone can sort of feel that strength in themselves, that
Yeah.
they can also play a role in changing something that they are not happy with.
To me, what this podcast and also the kind of purpose of CMM and talking about CMM in the world is about equipping people with the
Mm.
tools, not to simplify their world, but to lean into the existing complexity of it. Because I think that's part of the reason why people pull back is like, well, it wasn't modeled for me, or I don't feel like I have the tools to lean into this curiosity I feel because I've been taught that anything different, any different person, different culture, different opinion than mine is like a threat to my reality.
Mm.
But that's to me, and that's some of the language that, you know, shapes the name of this podcast, Stories Lived, Stories Told. There's this model within CMM that's called the loop model, and it's L, bunch of U's, and then two T's. And the L is lived stories, and the T at the end is told stories. So there's the name of the podcast. But then in between are all these other stories like unknown stories, untold stories, untellable stories. And that could really go on and on infinitely, you know? And it's such a great reminder to me. And it was probably something that I really latched onto in my early understanding of this theory, that it was so new. I will say for
Mm.
me, I think I had a kind of very simple understanding of the world. It was very new for me to try to wrap my head around the idea that many, many stories can coexist at the same time. And this is taking me back to the systems thinking perspective, which is so interesting now that I'm thinking about it to overlay on a communication perspective, because I think choosing to be a systems thinker or a systems designer, which both of us have expressed, well, I don't know if I'm a systems designer. I don't know what it takes to
Mm.
be that. I think that's just a title you can give yourself, first of all, is my impression. Everybody can consider themselves a systems thinker and a designer to their own extent. They're at least designing their own social worlds, you know, and their own systems in that way. But it's systems thinking is one of those stories. And I think it's a really beautiful story. So when we can see ourselves as part of a system, or when we're designing, if we can think in terms of systems, you've used the word
Mm.
holistically, you know, taking a holistic approach. I think that's a really helpful story. There's a lot
Mm.
of stories that I think are harmful. I think that's a really helpful story in my own experience, at least.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about how I've become the person I am,
Yeah.
or why I have the interest that I have. Like, why am I so interested in food, in caring for the natural world, in seeing ecosystems survive?
Hmm.
Why do I care so much about relationships and this relationality? between all the living things, like where does that come from? I was not raised in a culture, in a family even that was vocal about this in any way. Like it's not. So what are all the stories that I've been told through my relationships, people or nature or landscapes or media or books or whatever? It is very interesting just to start to look at yourself as one system, or like the center of your life system of what you've been affected by.
Yeah. Well, what are some of those stories, or what are some of those experiences that you think led you to have the perspective on food systems and regeneration that you do now?
Just from when I was very, very young, I've always been allowed to cook, always been allowed to be in the kitchen. That was never an issue. I loved all these strange things, from I was able to like crawl to the fridge and open the vegetable drawer. I was not one of those picky kids. I could eat olives, like a jar full of olives, and loved it. And I was always out in the forest picking wild berries and mushrooms with my family, fishing with my grandfather. So I've always been, these have just been natural things around me. And then as I got older, I've been really fortunate to work with people who ran very value-based businesses, I would say, like my first restaurant job, where we had local produce in season just because that makes sense, and because then you can know your farmers or your producer relations. And we had edible flowers on all the dishes in the summer because it's beautiful, and we grew it ourselves outside the restaurant. And we used whole, like full fat cream and butter and everything because it just tastes better and it's all natural, unprocessed. There was always a reason behind it, and it was all of these things that came with care and relationships, I would say.
Yeah, a real sense of modeling, maybe, of like other people. I don't know if you'd call that. That seems almost like formal, like, not that they were necessarily trying, like, we have to be this way so that other people are this way. But there's an element of that just kind of happens, I think.
Or that you want to show something to a lot of other people because you are in that situation, like if you're running a restaurant or serving a lot of people food in some kind of way, or producing food, being a farmer and providing for a lot of people. I mean, you have quite a lot of power to show people that this is also possible. And I think that firsthand experiences, like personal experiences through seeing something, sensing something in like different ways, smelling it, touching it, feeling it, observing it, or being in it, is one of the most impactful ways of being changed, or being moved, or acquiring new worldviews, sort of. Also through storytelling is a very, very strong way of making that happen. But I think if you yourself are an active participator in that storytelling, it leaves such a mark on you.
This is taking me back to language that I know you've talked about too. So I'm curious to know your definition or how you use this language, but the idea of like care and caring. And that's something that I think I've reflected on a lot in my life, because I have felt like I care so deeply about things. Like I feel like I get really invested in them. And I remember kind of starting to notice a tension around caring about things, probably when I was like a teenager in high school, because that system that I was in and that social world that I was in, the message that I started to pick up on was, it is not cool to care too much about things. Like it's, oh, whatever, you're a teenager, you don't, whatever. But I cared so deeply about things. And so I remember feeling that dissonance of like, oh, I shouldn't care so deeply about things. And I think, not that I stopped caring about things, but, thinking about the social world. And again, that's a story that was kind of told in that realm. And for me, it helped me to appreciate caring as a choice in some ways, and also something that is really, really vulnerable. Because if I say to you, I care about this thing, that's me saying like, I would be really upset if something happened to this, or I'm like investing my time and energy and emotions into this. Like, I think caring about anything is a kind of innately very like vulnerable
Mm,
thing to do
mm,
that in a lot of ways, I think probably not just in, my teenager world, but seeps into as these teenagers grow up, there's maybe spaces where we don't feel like we can be honest about what we care about because it feels too vulnerable.
yeah, and also that's if we have those areas challenged, it is
Yeah.
very painful to maybe change our perspective on that thing because we
Hmm.
have cared about it in the way that it is or was
Hmm.
to us so deeply. So, sometimes you learn something that just really makes you think differently
Hmm.
about an area, a thing, a question. I mean, something new that you really feel, okay, this is a truth that I find is truthful, but it is really conflicting with what I thought to be true about this before.
Yeah.
That is very painful, and I think that's like what you're saying. It's painful, it's vulnerable, it's painful, it's uncomfortable, and I think this is a huge reason to why we are not willing to change.
Yeah.
I'm thinking so much like, how can I be part of making so many more people care
Hmm.
about the food that they eat
Hmm.
and the systems that they come from? Because food, I'm sure many of the listeners have sort of gotten this message that the food system is a reason for so many of the massive problems that we're facing as a global society today. And it can really be a huge solution area as well.
Hmm.
But it's uncomfortable because we need to change a lot of things for that to happen, and how to make people care about these changes actually happening. Can we do that through communication? Like, what's a good way in? I would love to learn more about, like, if there is research about some of the most impactful ways of getting new truths or new stories across.
Yeah. Yeah. One context that feels really relevant right now is that in the United States, we are entering a new presidency, and there's a lot of stories coming out of that says
Yeah.
we don't care about you or this
Mm.
or the environment. We only care about our power and protecting our power and making lots of money. That's the story that I'm perceiving, at least.
Yeah, me too.
And I think I've just been thinking about it so much because it feels so overwhelming.
Mm.
Even someone who's like me, who's so committed to seeing myself as an active participant in creating my social world, feels very hopeless because everything feels so big. Like, I'm just one person. How could
Mm.
I speak a different story into this space where the dominant story now that is being told is the exact opposite? So I'm curious about, I think, kind of where my reflections have led me, thinking about what CMM has to say to this time is like, everything feels so big. Maybe CMM has us go small,
Mm.
small in terms of like down to that relational level.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about where care enters into the conversation we're having around your work with like community,
Mm.
and how does what's like the small things that you're paying
Mm.
attention to within food systems that are making a difference?
I when you said the small parts, I was really thinking about this online course I've been doing now this month, which is from the ETH Zurich University in Switzerland. Really, really interesting, good resource dense, great course called Designing Resilient Regenerative Systems.
Mm.
So it's a series of some free courses you can take, and it's a level up where you can join the next level, which does cost quite a lot, but it entails more like physical meetings through traveling and more live talks and discussions,
Hmm.
and can result in a master's. And it's about so many topics, but one of them is this about quantum theory and looking at how things work on the tiniest scale
Yeah.
does really affect how they work or happen in the larger scale, because it's just everything is a result of those sort of tiny particles and how they move around each other. The things I'm paying attention to is from farmers, for example, what are really their challenges and barriers, but also really where do they find joy? Where do they find motivation? What is it that really gives them drive? Because if there's one thing I've experienced is that farmers are the most solution-oriented people
Yeah.
I've ever met. It's like, yeah, just tell me what you want me to do and I'll fix it. No problem. I just need, some kind of incentive.
Mm.
And to me, I write about regeneration and relationality together because I that is where the magic happens. I've been working some years in a Norwegian startup building systems and technology for direct trade, transparent direct trade between farmers and professional buyers like chefs and kitchens, and just seeing those relationships emerge and being built between the farmer and the chef, or the seller and buyer, or just like they're all dependent on each other, and seeing the strength and sort of wealth in those relationships. There is nothing that can compete, because when you have a relationship to another person,
Yeah.
you do care about that person at some level. You are able to have empathy with that person. You probably respect that person, and you can, the more you get to know each other, the more you can try to put yourself in their situation. You will be more willing to give because you also get. Yeah, it's a more dynamic way of structuring our social worlds, instead of, like we talked about earlier, this disconnected way of building our society. So for me, that is just a very, very physical or concrete example of the way relationships can make things emerge or actually manifest or happen. Again, because we are the active participants changing those things. But if we're not active, if we're not building those relationships, then we're not part of creating these stories. And I think all of these sort of resistance movements are the small things that I'm latching onto in times that feel very, like you said, a bit hopeless. Or like, how on earth are we going to get our stories through when there are so many dominant stories that want the complete opposite? But the more people who take part in our stories, the stronger they are, and the more power they can have. And I do really believe that. And I also really do believe in local stories.
Yeah.
There is, again, the context part. These stories of food systems, for example, they cannot and will not and should not be the same or be able to be replicated all over the world. A food system in the US is completely different than a food system in Norway, or just here where I'm sitting on the southern tip of Norway. They will be completely different than on the west coast, where there are mountains and different climates, or in the north. I can get really angry about all these things that are like, oh, we need to design this thing so it works, and there's like the perfect thing, and then we're just going to scale it up. And that's not what nature does. Nature doesn't design things to scale them out. They continuously evolve and push and pull to find a way to thrive in exactly the context that they're in. Yeah, so I really love the term that the biomimicry field uses of design or systems being conducive to life. Like, life is,
Yes.
we need to design in ways that are conducive to life, that enhances life, that is life-centric. Sadly, so much in our contemporary world is the opposite. So that is really what I want people to think about and to understand in terms of regeneration and relationality. And I use food systems sort of as a lens, because that's the world that I know best.
Yeah.
But it can definitely be used in all kinds of contexts.
Yeah. You've entered into a space that I like to call being CMM-ish. And I am so thankful for
Finally.
that language. Yes, you've made it. No, it's just great to hear the language you're using, and it resonates with me. And, this is something that I love so much, made me uncomfortable at first, but love so much about CMM, the theory as a practice, the community around it, is that it's not restrictive and it's not prescriptive. And so there's space for us to play with it. And to me, it's very embodied. And so a lot of things can be CMM-ish. It's not just, well, this is what's in the textbook or this is what's been written and everything outside of it is not the theory. There's a lot of things that are very CMM-ish in how you're thinking about things. And my experience with the theory, and with a lot, I would say, of like what I learned in my communication studies classes in undergrad, even, it was less of a like, oh, wow, that's new information, and more of a, yes, recognition of like, oh, you're talking about conflict styles, or you're talking about what we create in our relationships. I know that to be true, but now you've given me language for it. So I see that as being a really important function of CMM, is like giving us language, which helps us tell new stories. So what I'm hearing and what you're saying right now, in order to kind of, reframe or rephrase what you've said in a CMM-ish way, is that part of a change that can happen that maybe feels small, but can be very important, is around context, which we've already talked about so much. And I see this maybe feels tangential, but I promise I'm getting back to what you just talked about. To me, context, you can use it to look back. What was the context that we existed in? It's a great tool for reflection. And it can be really important looking forward. I think I did a little bit of that at the beginning of our conversation without even realizing that I was naming this context that I was in. And then I was saying, but I don't want that to be the context. I want the context to be this presence and curiosity and collective learning. And so I was kind of able to shift the context that I wanted to be at the highest level, which is very CMM-ish. There's levels of context. It's not, one big blob of context floating over us. You can kind of pull out distinction as that, the culture you're in is a context, the family stories you have, your interpersonal relationships, lots of layers of context. So if we're moving forward and thinking about, because the truth is, it's not, are you an active participant or not? We're all active participants. And what are you doing with that role? Do you have a kind of moral responsibility to, the language we would use, create better social worlds? So to me, what I think you're in a way asking people to do by your, working at this intersection of regeneration and relationality and resilience, I'll throw that word in there from your course, because I think that's great too, is asking people to put relationality at the highest level context and say everything else can, fall in line after that. But if we, right now, maybe a lot of systems prioritize profit, and they prioritize being able to scale something up, and they prioritize efficiency, productivity, on and on and on. That's the highest level context. Individuality,
relationality, for example.
So how would the system change if we changed our highest level context, or kind of priority,
Yeah. That's exactly why mindset shifts or worldviews, as also is a lot of the language in this course I mentioned, is how our worldviews are informed, or what worldviews we might have. The way we think, and that we're informed, and we can change the way we value things, like what we, for me, having worked with sort of putting value maybe at the highest, and not value in like monetary value, but like my inner values, actually values, plural, like what are my values and how can I put them to work in the choices that I make, or how I'm participating in a system or in my life. And I would really love to see a more value-based society, or communities based on values, rather than capitalist extractive profit as some kind of valuation of us or things or systems. Yeah, I find this really fascinating. And there was a great example of Maslow, talking about the hierarchy of needs. And the top of the pyramid is our self-realization and our like top of individuality. And when we have all things in order, we can just
You've made it.
Go ahead and grow ourselves. And after he wrote this, he actually went to an indigenous community in the US, the Blackfoot tribe, and experienced a very different thing than what he experienced in the modern American way of living. They were actually putting relational wealth in the center of their community, and being wealthy was to be able to help others and to be able to care for all the people in the community, no matter if they were poor or sick or maybe a big criminal. If you were realized when you were able to help those people because you had so much that you could, and that was seen as being wealthy. So I really love, like, another philosophy or world is like the theory, an economic theory of degrowth, where there's a lot of use of the word sufficiency, which I also really feel like needs to be part of a regenerative world.
Yeah.
Because to not use more than we actually need, to not take more than we need, or be happy and content when it's sufficient, because then it can keep going, then it can thrive.
Yeah.
So I would love to see a lot more relationality, sufficiency, and regeneration of minds and of ecology.
I'm curious if you have any stories or experiences that can kind of highlight this difference between what does a strong story around individuality create in a food system, or what does a strong story around community and relationality create in a food system?
Well, let's say you have several people are working like this, and to me it's just, of course, the most natural way to do it. But let's say you're very individualistic in your sort of way of thinking and doing, because that's what you're conditioned to. You might be a chef and you're buying vegetables directly from a farmer, but you're being extremely specific in your criteria of what you want to buy or what is good enough. Like wanting to buy zucchinis that are only 20 centimeters long and dark green, or only the red tomatoes, not the yellow ones, or like being very specific like this, which, yeah, you're a customer to the farmer, but that farmer may be having a super diverse, wonderful production, then sits with the whole harvest of other things that they're not even able to sell, just because there's no understanding from the other part of this dynamic of how a food system actually works when it's on nature's premises. Or you can do it in a more relational, community oriented way, where you say, I would like this many kilo of vegetables or this many kilo of zucchini and tomatoes. What do you have this week? And I will work with you, and we will create something great from what you have.
Yeah.
That also gives you more room and flexibility as a chef to say, I would really like something like this and that. And then maybe you will be able to get that because you have such a good relationship to your farmer relation that they are happy to try to make something that you're looking for. But it's again about this like give and take, to be helpful to each other, instead of just thinking about what I want and need. And you just have to deal with that. Does not work so well in the long run.
Yeah. Very different story about what you choose to prioritize. That's really helpful, I think, to demonstrate that. I have shared this with you as context and keep going back to an earlier conversation I had with Opera Dressdale about regeneration. That was kind of the first conversation I had that introduced that language to me. And I feel like I got, not that she was mean about it, but I was like put in my place, or like, I really learned a lot because I had been talking about sustainability all month with other people, and including a lot of environmental things. And nobody until her really kind of asked, like kind of dug into that more to say, well, sustainability, which is such a buzzword, I think, is not her, it wasn't her goal, at least. And she was saying that's actually not I'm going back to even this, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Somebody made a choice about what's the top of that pyramid. Maslow made a choice about what's the top of that pyramid. We've made a choice that the top of our pyramid, in terms of maybe like environmental well-being, sustainability. She was saying, I think a step beyond sustainability is regeneration. And then different conversations I had at this conference that you and I
Mm.
attended did help me to unpack that even more and say that, yeah, sustainability truly is about sustaining what we have.
Yes,
And do we
exactly.
actually like what we have?
No,
No
I
way.
could, I
Do we need
completely agree with you.
regeneration? Yeah, tell me more about what you think about
No,
that.
yeah, but I think we've been talking a lot about language, and I think it's really important to truly think hard about what do these different words mean. Different words you come across or keep using, and that or that people are using widely.
Mhm.
And there are some things that we would like to sustain, and there
Yep.
are many things that we wouldn't. Like, I do not want the economy or the economic system or economic way of, let's say, the paradigm
Yeah.
of capitalist economy. I do
Yes.
not want to sustain that. So when
Yes.
people talk about economic sustainability, I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, let's talk more about that. Or ecological sustainability. Yes, I want ecological systems and natural systems and cycles, like, the our soils, the water
Mhm,
cycles,
mhm.
nutrient cycles, biodiversity. I want those to be sustained.
Yeah, yeah.
I do. They need to keep functioning. I want what little we have left to keep being there. And I want it to grow, but I also want it to regenerate, become more. I mean, regeneration is, especially in agricultural terms, is very much about building life, enhancing life, creating more life. So more biodiversity, healthier soils, which with a lot more life in them. So I think, like, regenerating, just it also means growing back.
Mhm.
I mean, medical terms, it's a quite old term in
Yeah.
medicine, which is,
Yeah.
to regenerate damaged tissue, or,
Right.
a lot of sea creatures can grow back a tail or whatever.
Yes, yes.
Uh, so right now, this is really what we need. We need to get life back in all these
Mm.
systems that have been completely just extracted. The focus has been on extracting life and leaving nothing behind. So I've been critical about the term sustainability for quite a long time, and
Mhm.
also I just wrote this as like an opinion piece about this some years ago, about, like, we don't need sustainable food systems, we need regenerative food systems
Yeah.
to solve these problems. So I completely agree. And I really hope that regeneration is not gonna have the same fate as sustainability as a
Yes,
word.
yes.
It's already happening, but we need to just keep having these conversations, so that we can keep the meaning and
Mhm.
spread what it actually is about. So we can catch the false stories when we hear them.
Yes.
Mm.
You're prompting me perfectly because I wanted to bring it back to stories too. And I think I love
Mm.
doing this podcast is I just crave hearing people's stories. They mean so much to me. And I am curious if you have any other stories you wanted to share about not that there has to be like a moral or a lesson to take away from it, but what's a like meaningful experience that you've had? I'm thinking about things that you shared during the presentation that originally,
Mm.
drew me to you. You were so story oriented. So yeah, I'd be curious to know if you've got any last stories you wanted to share just about the experiences you've had on this journey of leaning into all
Mm.
of this and learning about it.
Some of the stories that I leaned on in the presentation and shared photos from was, for example, from a biodynamic farm here in Norway outside of Oslo, that some very good friends of mine run as a second generation now. And I lived there last year, from April to September. So sort of through the main growing season. It's a vegetable focused biodynamic farm, extremely diverse. And they also have a lot of people coming through the farm every season, because they have both interns that come from their studies in organic agriculture. So a few of those, and a whole bunch of woofers,
Mm-hmm.
which is a term for, it stands for Worldwide Opportunity in Organic Farming.
Yeah.
So it's voluntary work on organic farms around the world, and you get housing and food for your work. So it's a great way to travel and to learn and to meet people. And I came from having left a PhD position that I was in for half a year, moved to another city, another country far away. It was winter. It was a very, very hard winter, and it was a hard decision to give it up, but I had to acknowledge that it wasn't serving me so well. And I came from maybe being disappointed of that whole endeavor being so hard and being a real struggle. It was the hardest winter I ever went through.
Mm-hmm.
And also coming straight before that from my startup experience that was 10 years wrapped into 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of work, and also like you said in the intro, like we are both recovering perfectionists, like always having
Yeah,
been
yeah.
extremely hard on myself. So I came with all of this energy of like being a bit disappointed in myself or feeling like I needed to show myself that I was able or worthy or something like this. And I came into this amazing space of care for everything around us and each other and community and sharing and working together. And I was like angry. I was like, oh, why are these other people not working as fast as like faster? Why are they not seeing all the work we have to do? Like, why are they not
Yeah.
striving harder? And after a couple of weeks, I really saw myself from the outside
Mm-hmm.
doing this. I mean, it did not immediately change, but
Sure.
over these months, it did really change so much. And I'm so grateful for these lovely, lovely people that I got to share the season with that came. They were very different. They were
Mm-hmm.
extremely caring and extremely kind to themselves and to others. And yeah, that really helped me to change, to be kinder to myself as well, and to be a lot more mindful and a lot more fully caring for all of these relationships that were surrounding me that I was also a part of, and that we to see how much we all affect each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you really do get affected by someone with bad energy one day.
Yeah.
So to be really mindful of that and to remember that we do affect the people around us a lot, and to maybe see to find those people that can pull us in, yeah, a more caring direction,
Yeah.
and sort of have that as the main narrative for everything we do. I do think that a lot of things would be so much better if that was actually the context that we arrived with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly see you as someone that's pulling us toward being more caring. And I want to share a story that's your story combined with my story of hearing your story. That in your presentation, one of the more maybe confronting stories, moments, and slides that you shared is you had two pictures. One is you hugging a goat, and then you eating a burger. And you said, "This is
Mm.
a goat." And tell me if I'm getting this wrong.
Yeah.
My memory, this is a goat. You told us her name. You were hugging her in this picture, and then you said, and then we ate this goat a couple days later or something like that. And it was kind of like, maybe the vibe in the room was a little like, oh, this is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But like we just talked
But I
about,
wanted you to
you
feel
need to lean
that.
into the discomfort because it was
Yeah.
a little like confronting, like, oh, but then also like, yes, there is a caring,
Mm.
connected, relational, not just with other humans, but with other beings,
Mm.
relational way to engage in a food system. And yeah,
Mm.
that my experience of that was very much like, oh, this is really important because this is a story. This is an untold story in a lot of ways for
Yeah.
a lot of people that is what keeps us so disconnected from the food system that we are actually intimately involved within. So,
Yeah, and I mean, eating Vila, which was her name,
yes.
in an extremely, like, we made a very grand happening about this
Yeah.
because she was driven by the farmer himself to the abattoir, or to the small slaughterhouse. It was a small place in Italy, and they got the meat back very quickly, and we ground it up. We made burgers. We baked burger buns from scratch. We harvested vegetables from the garden. You know, it's extremely idyllic.
Yeah.
Um, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful natural wine from neighboring farmer friend. And I found it really important to, like, before we all started eating, to say, okay, everyone, let's say thank you to Vila and appreciate her. And you know, it does do a lot to you in terms of valuing your food,
Yeah.
valuing what nourishes you or provides for you. I think if we had this in mind,
Hmm.
we would choose so differently what
Yes.
we buy and what we eat and how we handle the food that surrounds us. And I've thought many times lately that all the nudging and all the things, activities that are being done to try to make people change their way of eating, their diets, what they choose to buy, how they choose to buy it, which are all like ways of voting for some kind of system.
Yes.
Every
Yeah.
day, every time you
Yes.
buy something, it's a
Yeah.
vote.
I always say like
Yeah.
communication is so much more than words. Like every action you take communicates something. That's kind of the
Yeah,
parallel to what you're saying
exactly.
about voting. Yeah.
And I think we spend there are so many great initiatives and things being done to try to, spread knowledge, spread values, spread stories, to have people change the way, like to change their habits or the way they're
Mm-hmm.
doing something. And I just think that, I mean, yes, it takes a lot of energy and time, but if we could get like every person out on a great farm to experience
Yeah.
that themselves, I think like that would be the same amount of energy and time spent through all of these other small actions, but that impact would just be so massive.
Yeah.
And I've also seen that it only takes one time to meet face to face for a farmer and a customer of them, someone who will then rely on them
Mm-hmm.
or who will buy from them,
Mm-hmm.
to make that relationship really strong. And then you can talk on the phone, you can text with them, but just that one physical meeting is like,
Yeah.
I now have a relationship to you.
Yeah.
You're not just a name or a label.
Yeah.
So more of that,
Yeah.
I hope.
I hope so too. I don't know. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I hate that I have to wrap it up, but I like to say, as was offered to me by a previous guest of the podcast, that the end of this episode is not a period, it's a comma. There's more. I like to say, the conversation doesn't end just because the episode does. So, I'll include ways for people to get in contact with you. And I hope you and I will continue to be in conversation. And the thing that I want to leave people with, I know I've spoken to you already about this CMM-ish language of better social worlds, that's the goal. We say a kind of helpful way to frame CMM is it offers us a perspective. And I've talked about that, a communication perspective. It offers us practices like models that I've, referenced today. And it offers us a goal, and that goal is better social worlds. And so I really like to contextualize my conversations with that language. So I'm not going to ask us to get into it, because what I actually want to do, because I think we've already alluded to it in so many ways, to me, it's obvious, but everyone's going to make their own meaning. So I'd rather leave people with that, as that's what comes next after the conversation, is to start doing their own reflecting and connecting those dots of how is this work? How is creating regenerative food systems? Everything we talked about today, prioritizing relationality. How is all of this part of us creating better social worlds? So I think we've, said our piece. We've said some really beautiful things. I think today I'm really, really happy with what we've created. I feel very energized and even more curious about this idea. So thank you so much for everything you brought to this conversation and for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was lovely. Always fun to try to put words and language to all these
It's a
things
great
that float
practice.
around in my head all the time. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Edona.
Thank you for the talk, Abby.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.